Beyond the Books is a podcast from the University of Edinburgh School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at research and the people who make it happen. I'm Emma Aviet, a first-year PhD student of English literature and current postgraduate web and communications intern. Because of this last year, we've most likely all been having discussions about health and medical treatments, as well as how governments worldwide provide medical aid. Because of this, I thought it would be great to reach out to Anna Kemball, fourth-year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, to discuss her research in the medical humanities. Anna focuses on a range of indigenous writers across Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, exploring how texts from the 1980s through to present day might be read alongside the ongoing governmental commitment towards promoting indigenous mental health and improving health policies in practice. Anna's work looks at the tensions between indigenous ideas of health and wellness with Western settler governments' healthcare systems. Beyond that, as a first-year PhD student, it was of personal interest to get a few tips from a PhD student who has made great use of her time. Even for non-students, I think Anna's responses are insightful and interesting and shed light on an exciting area of research. So stay safe, everyone, and thank you for listening. Okay, there we go. Hi, how are you doing?
Hi, Emma. I'm doing okay. I'm managing all right in lockdown mostly.
Yeah, it's been like a pretty crazy year. I think I was hoping that 2021 looked like it was going to be a little bit less of a crazy year, but I feel like it's it's so far continuing in the
I th-
same pattern.
I think we all did. I actually came home for Christmas like a lot of students did, and then lockdown was started, so I'm still at my parents'. Didn't quite expect to be away from Edinburgh for so long, but we're making it work.
Gosh, yeah, no, I know that happened to quite a few people.
Hmm.
But at least it's home and not anywhere else. But hopefully we'll be back soon.
Hmm.
So let's kind of just jump into it by maybe you could give us a quick summary about who you are, just how you came to the University of Edinburgh, a little bit about your background.
Yeah. I'm Anna Kemball, and I'm a fourth year PhD student on the English Literature program at LLC. And before that, I have done previous degrees, including a master's in post-colonial literature at the University of Leeds. Um, so I started my PhD back in 2017, which now seems like a very long time ago. But my PhD, really, I come from, like I said, like that post-colonial studies background, but I've kind of specified even further into the world of indigenous studies and settler colonial criticism, um, and with a background in medical humanities, which is an interdisciplinary field involving how health, culture, and all sorts of artistic creations are related, as well as how we we educate and reform medical practice and medical institutions in our societies. So it's quite interdisciplinary, but for me, it still comes down to a focus on studying how contemporary Indigenous authors are engaging with ideas of health and well-being at a time which medically we've seen a lot of progress and development in health policy, and how medical institutions are reforming how they treat Indigenous patients, sort of the two in dialogue with each other.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a really incredibly necessary and important field of research. It's one of those things that
Well, thank you.
yeah, I mean, when I was reading about what you focus on, I'm like, of course, this is an issue. Like, this is something that needs to have more light shed on it, especially during, like we were just saying, this pretty insane year that's been happening. And so I know you said that you had a background also in post-colonial literature at your master's level. And then one
Mhm.
thing I want to touch on, I think, before I get and ask you more about that and about your post-colonial research is I know you also have a degree in both music and English. And I was wondering how you study those two things together.
Ultimately, it came down to the fact that they were my favorite two subjects at school, and I probably couldn't make my mind up, but I'd always studied these at school and in college alongside each other, so maybe seems like they're quite distinct subjects, but at the time of me doing my undergraduate degree, I was so used to thinking through these two disciplines in tandem that I just kept along that line of studying how we close read pieces of music, we close read texts, how we look at the cultural and historical contexts that inform artistic development, whether it's narrative or music.
That's so interesting. I mean, that definitely makes sense. I've never really thought about close reading music and applying some of the same skills that you use when you're close reading text, but I can see how that would open up a whole new realm and aspect of the music that you might not think about when you're just listening to it.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's through a recording and listening, or whether you're literally like finding the printed music and orchestral scores, and you might be annotating, highlighting the same way that you would uh, a written narrative, and learning to identify, learning the different components, and how you would apply terms to certain structures, techniques, everything like that.
Would you ever think about producing an article where you kind of intertwine the two or research them in tandem?
Um, Probably not now. That's an interesting question. But I feel like as I've progressed through my masters, and there is work that is related to music and music therapy in the medical humanities for sure. I haven't yet kind of found a way to make sense of like that triangle of indigenous literature, music, and medical humanities. So it's maybe one plate too many to keep spinning all at the same time.
So, kind of shifting, I guess, more now in the more recent years, then.
Mhm.
I kind of wanted to know, how did you get into Indigenous literature and the medical humanities? I know that, like you said, they're two kind of separate fields that you're doing a really great job of combining. But did you just find an interest in both naturally, or was that something that you saw in your coursework?
So the department I was based in at Leeds has quite a well-established reputation, I'd say, for having like post-colonial specialism within their English literature degree. A lot of brilliant researchers are based there, and that isn't a recent thing. For the last couple of decades. Post-colonial studies has really been taught and studied at Leeds, so it was something that was readily available for me to take classes in, and um, alongside that, there was modules often offered by these very scholars who were, on one hand, post-colonial studies researchers, and they were offering modules in something I'd never heard of, which was the medical humanities. Um, so that took my interest to see classes that were about how disability is represented, or how narrative is such an important component in experiencing illness, discussing it with your doctor or medical professional, and what's the relationship between narratives within literature and narratives within healthcare settings. It just really fascinated me when I was choosing modules for the final year of my degree. Um, and from there, I think something I really enjoyed about the medical humanities classes by this point of finishing my degree, and I didn't know that I was going to go do a master's. I'm not someone who always knew I wanted to do a PhD, so this wasn't in my mind then. But I love the fact that the types of conversations I was having in the seminar room around health and disability was often quite well matched to the conversations I would have within my family, or my social uh, circle of friends, in the way that we would be discussing how to care for my grandmother with dementia, or I have relatives with autism, and the way that narrative and autism were relayed in novels was a key component of these modules. So I think it made sense for me to make um, to incorporate a little bit of my own life and the life outside of university with what I was studying. Even if I wasn't personally studying the experiences of family members, I was learning a lot more about how we can approach these subjects and themes as without being experts in medicine, right? Without being doctors, everyone can still relate to and gain meaning from stories and representations of these illness that are special, that are targeted, sorry, to a general audience rather than a very well trained medical expert of a doctor. So it started from there. Really, they were my favorite classes, and they were the ones that excited me to go into the library and keep on reading and keep learning more about these fields of study and how they've grown and developed.
I think that's really interesting to hear that these traditionally underrepresented areas like the medical humanities, literature on mental health, or literature on indigenous populations were an option for you during your undergrad and master's and PhD level studies. Do you think that's something that is becoming more accessible now? Are we shifting more towards that as a field, or is there still a lot of work to do to, really shed light on these really important areas that haven't historically had the spotlight?
I think we've definitely got the sense that that's what we should be doing. And I'm not sure if ambition is the right word, but I can see, in both Edinburgh and other departments, there is the drive to want to diversify or incorporate more texts and writers and um, bodies of work from other culture. I think the challenging thing is to really critically question how we can go about that in an ethical and a responsible way that isn't simply just like extracting cultural material from one culture and saying we can make use of this, it's fun to discuss this in a classroom, and it be completely devoid of like the meaning and significance from where that text or that artist has come from.
Definitely. I think that what you're saying is true. We, as literature students, are really kind of told there is the central canon of literature that is the accepted field that we must know, we must have memorized, and those are the books that are deemed as having been worthy of this, kind of transcendent position of classic literature. And it sort of leads to this belief that certain voices, traditionally, I mean, white male voices, are given this source of power over and over again instead of really including different perspectives and points of view. Do you think this literary canon issue is something that we're still having to figure out how to work with today?
Well, I'm sure it's that those methods that you employ or the theory that you bring into how you go about reading even these canonical texts that can be really important, and that's been a huge part of my thesis has been to think through how can I'm a non-indigenous researcher, so how can I go about this project and with the firm belief that here in the UK we should be doing more to study indigenous literatures and other forms of art, but how can we do that in an appropriate way, without it almost history repeating itself, where the Britain colonizes the world, takes artifacts, brings them into our institutions and museums of power, and suddenly they're valued, but in a very contained way. And I don't want the way that non-indigenous researchers do this kind of work. I don't want it to mimic that process of extracting and containing and prescribing a value that's on my terms rather than on the terms of the
Yeah,
culture.
fair. I guess even just the way I was phrasing that, bringing them into our canon, is that the way that we need to think about this? Or is it that sort of idea of making sure that we need to not redominate and claim ownership of that literature? So I think that's something that's a really interesting point. And I guess that was one thing I was really interested about. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you is coming from this different background from the authors of the books that you're reading most of the time. How have you kept that in mind when you're looking at a new book? What is the process like, I guess, about when you approach a new culture and you decide that that is the area that you want to learn about? What are some resources that you go to kind of educate yourself?
Well, at both master's level and now in my PhD, I've been really fortunate to be supervised uh, by non-indigenous researchers who have done that type of work already within their career. Um, More specifically with a Maori and a New Zealand context than with some of the other cultures I look at. So from the beginning of my masters onwards, I've learned a lot from how they've done their work. Um, and once you start digging through the library and digging through some of the databases, there is a lot of material out there, especially aimed at settler scholars, is the term I'd use. So that's probably not quite appropriate for me as a British non-Indigenous person, but whether it's how white Canadians can research and work in indigenous studies, or how white Americans, white New Zealanders. There's less theoretical and methodological material out there for people like me who then again removed and studying from within a European context. But it's a process. I don't think I will have had my like process completely refined by the end of this PhD. And I know researchers in Britain who are like professors who have full established careers, and they know they're always learning how to better enhance and reform our methods of doing this type of work. One thing that is important, and it's probably something, if I continue along this line of research, I would want to engage with more, especially once COVID's over, is how if there was a narrower project I was doing that involved fewer cultures, then to really try and engage with in collaboration and in partnership with people from that place. That's not exactly been possible when my PhD is thematic and it's about bringing work from 4 broad indigenous cultures together. And then, COVID happened and other things that have just meant I've had to stay put in the UK. But involving community and learning directly from scholars and researchers is so important.
I would like to hear if this is okay, because I know that obviously you're in the sensitive 4th year and you might not yet want to give too much detail about what your PhD is. Could you give me like kind of the broad thesis statement of what you're looking at in your PhD?
Yeah, so I very much locate my work in the critical medical humanities, or perhaps it's easier to understand the second wave of the medical humanities. And part of that second wave, which started around within the last 10 years, has been to critically address the Western biases and assumptions of the field, um, with the recognition that, as we've been talking about, and with the recognition that there is far more to be learned and far more knowledges about health, representations of health and medicine out there. How can the medical humanities work with that, or incorporate that? So that's where my work is situated, at this kind of turning point for the field as it sees how we could go about that project. And I look at how health and well-being has been represented by Indigenous authors in North America, Australia, and New Zealand in the last 30 years. It's very much situated alongside a period of about 20 years where there has been a lot of development in how the medical institutions in these countries have reformed their practices of health, their health policy, and thought, how can we better treat Indigenous patients? How can we incorporate an Indigenous workforce into our hospitals? How can we incorporate the knowledges of health, the methods of healing that have been within these cultures for centuries and centuries? How can we bring that into perhaps a modern clinical space, if you like? So it's quite a specific theme, but it's as soon as I started reading around some of the well-known and lesser-known Indigenous authors who write in English, health and this idea of tying health to the strength of your culture, the strength of language, the strength of a community is very, very important. And it comes up time and time again. So I kind of knew I knew there was a project in here somewhere, because so many writers seem to be approaching a similar theme. I think it comes from having that recognition, and probably all of us living through COVID have got a better, more grounded sense of that. But having that recognition that medicine and navigating like improving your health or being treated for your health is so much more than biomedicine, and so much more than like the clinical tests. It's about communication and culture, and is there a shared sense of values, a shared like purpose related to how you treat someone, or how you help a community to address trauma. And a lot of these kind of wider themes about how medicine is so much more than a blood test or an X-ray have really like been forged in some of the earlier work in medical humanities. So that's been really useful for me to bring into dialogue with the holistic nature of Indigenous
Yeah,
health
I
too.
think this kind of reminds me of the article that I, can talk about because it's been published and that you won the New Zealand Essay Prize for, which is very impressive. Which is
Thank
the
you.
Names That We Do Not Understand: Reframing Schizophrenia and Spirituality in the People Faces, which is a novel by Lisa Charrington. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And that is basically the story of a Maori woman, Nikki, and her brother Joshua, and his
Mhm.
diagnosis with schizophrenia. And I thought you did such an amazing job in that article laying out that what the Western medical field in New Zealand thought of as this really impeding diagnosis that was something that needs to be medicated or worked through, or was really different to how his culture and his family was viewing the diagnosis. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit, maybe explain more about that tension that's in the article that you kind of unravel.
Yeah, sure. That material is something I developed in my master's dissertation, so it's stretching back a little while now. But Lisa Charrington was still is, but was such a fascinating author for me to study. I no longer work with that novel in my PhD thesis because I've written that material already. But as well as being a writer, Lisa Charrington, who is Maori herself, is a very like prominent clinical psychologist in New Zealand, and so it was a wonderful novel to study alongside the research that she has produced and published, um, in like in those fields of research. In psychology, she's been extremely interested in how, as we've been saying, how Maori patients can better be treated in mental health spaces. Um, she promotes sort of not just certain approaches, but really approaches bringing Maori worldviews and Maori principles and values into those spaces, because often that will then it will make it not just a safer space, but a more appropriate space to treat the whole of the patient, um, for whatever psychiatric illness that may be. And we see in the novel, something I was so interested in was how she was translating her research and her doctoral research almost into a novel. She discusses some of the like differences between Western perceptions of schizophrenia and how it's a much more complex issue in Maori culture, that it's some will see it as an illness, sure, but others will see it as a set of spiritual gifts, or somewhere in between. It won't be pathologized, or it wouldn't be seen like revered. It's just something. Oh, you hear voices of perhaps deceased relatives. That's a very normal experience. Um, and so she kind of brings all of these worldviews, some contrasting, some in line with each other, into the novel. That is very it's narrated. I'm not sure if you've been able to read it, but it's narrated by so many members of Joshua's family, and with a few shorter passages of being narrated from the doctors themselves. And so you really get so many perspectives from the positions of carers and relatives, but also cultural perspectives, about this person's condition. And something I was really trying to convey in the article is how we as readers are also invited into this space, that even as a text, it's almost mirroring some of the symptoms that Joshua feels, a lot of confusion, a lot of hearing voices that might not be there, that we're not sure what voices we can or can't trust. Um, and so well, for me personally, having always sort of found I can learn a lot from literature, this to me was a really rich way of learning about the different cultural worldviews surrounding it, in this instance schizophrenia, in a much more dynamic and participatory way than simply going and reading Charrington's research in a psychiatric journal, for example. And I liked the combination of being able to present these ideas in different discourses, as well as in fiction, and learn more about a particular subject or topic through that experience of reading fiction. But we've always kind of got to keep in mind that this is not the same as reading a case study. And I think that's where like the joys but the difficulties of analyzing these, like the idea of a danger of a single story, and it do we take this as being representative? Where do we see these moments of artistic license and fiction and, entertainment come in and kind of inflect within these medical narratives, fictional narratives?
I think that was one thing that I noticed that you pointed out at the end, which is that Joshua's narration doesn't come in until the end. His own reflection on how they're trying to treat him, basically. And at the
Yeah.
end, it kind of focuses on him and reminds you that this is an individual, and this whole kind of conversation around how do we treat him, how do we combine all the culture, how do we combine what the Western medicine decides
Mm.
is correct. I think that was a point that I thought you made quite well in the article, that like, well, there's also that room for the individual, and this is an individual story, even if there's way more than just one individual commenting on it and trying to
Mm.
decide how to treat this man. Where does the individual come in when you're also balancing in culture and you're also balancing in medical practice?
Yeah, it certainly, especially like, as a Western reader, it's quite tantalizing. Like, I just want to hear that person's voice straight away. But what I can't remember if I said this in the article right way back when, but I probably should have done. Um, Something that maybe would seem a bit unusual to us, that his story, especially about his schizophrenia, is relayed by so many family members, especially before his own story. Um, and we might feel that impulse to really want the individual story first and foremost, is slightly, in opposition is too strong a word, I suppose, but it's more normal within Maori culture to also include the perspectives and the stories of family members, and not as a secondary set of opinions, but as dynamic and interrelated. It's really important to have the knowledge and the version of events as relayed by Nikki and relayed by his grandparents. That is an important aspect of promoting the values that they have as a Maori family. Discuss the whole family's health. Discuss how we can improve this experience for the whole family as well. It's a bit nuanced, and it's kind of, there are key differences there, but perhaps not so binary opposite as you might first think.
So, shifting for a moment from the individual to the statistical point of view, if anything can erase the individual more than statistics, you've recently written a blog post called Post Apocalyptic Peoples: COVID-19, Public Health, and Native Americans, which explores the statistical erasure of Native Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you tell me a bit more about this post and what it discusses?
Yeah, so this is a blog post I wrote towards the end of 2020. It's still such a, obviously, we're still in the pandemic and it's such a raw, ongoing situation, but I wanted to start to make sense, even if it was loosely and informally, start to make sense of some of the things I've already been studying about settler colonial histories of health and medicine, and the, the current experience, specifically in this case of Native Americans. And it's I mean, it's out of my comfort zone, but it's something that was really surprising to me in the way that the pandemic and its impact on Native Americans was being reported. Was there was almost this hyper visibility and this hyper awareness in media articles, or by journalists, sort of this complete awareness of how the Navajo had been impacted. And so in one sense there was like a hyper focused awareness, very visual, plenty of photographs, of what lockdown looks like there. In complete contrast, as the various waves of the pandemic have unfolded over the last year, there's been a real problem and a real lack of consistency in how public health data has been collected, if at all, and reported. Obviously, it's such a complicated project to do in real time across 50 states. But even as recently as last month, when some of the latest figures revealed that Native Americans are the cultural and ethnic group in America with the highest rate of death due to COVID-19. Um, about, but as recently as these numbers are still coming in, there's an acknowledgement from the CDC and others that this is a very inadequate data set, and they predict that whilst they're saying probably about 1 in 450 Native Americans have died over the past year due to COVID, and yet they say we expect the number is actually far greater than that. So going back to the blog post, I've kind of done a bit of a roundabout discussion there. There's been a long history of this idea of erasing Native Americans, either, quite frankly, through genocide and through warfare, displacement, or through like the erasing the cultural awareness of Native Americans and perpetuating stereotypes rather than the lived actuality of and varied actuality of these people's lives. It's easier to sort of point to a very skewed set of problematic images and say this is what a Native American looks like, rather than someone who lives in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. And so when these cities are not reporting, as they haven't been reporting whether Native American patients have had COVID-19, that they just don't collect the data due to connected to culture and ethnicity. It's then very hard for tribes and tribal governments to be aware of the scale of the problem. And this theme of erasing the native or eliminating the native continues even in public health data, which I can only imagine will have further consequences, as well as the very real grief of such a significant loss that is still happening. It could potentially, as this health crisis gets historicized and researched and people look into it, if we don't have the information, how are we going to be able to draw like reliable conclusions or allocate appropriate resources, appropriate funding resources and medical resources if the problem seems a lot less than what it might actually be? There's a really, when I was writing this blog post, there was a really provocative quote for me from the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute. And there's a real significant problem in not collecting the data in some of the United States major cities. But the director, Abigail Echo Hawke, said, if the data doesn't exist, we don't exist, because that's ultimately how the governments are going to respond. And, it's really challenging.
Beyond that statistical erasure, do you find there to be cultural erasure of Indigenous populations within the general public?
Whether it's my students or whether it's my friends, like sometimes it's out of like sheer surprise that even to hear that Indigenous writers write in English and publish best-selling books, books that will hit the New York Times bestseller list. And that look of surprise or, I never thought of that, especially here in the UK, has happened to me like often enough that I think just there's a clear lack of awareness and of kind of a very old-fashioned idea of what we might think of when we hear the terms Australian Aboriginal or Native American. We probably don't think of 21st century writers. So I do think there's a lot to be said for how, like, first of all, awareness of their very presence and awareness of a modern contemporary presence, but then through that an awareness of our colonial histories and what has happened to really, really affect and impact, whether it was related to health or other issues, impact Indigenous communities. That can then come once you actually realise that there are Indigenous people who speak English and who write novels and who live in ordinary lives in the 21st century. I think because we're at a geographical distance here in the UK, there's a much less awareness of that. I can only hope it will improve, and I think it is improving, whether that's through certain novelists being awarded very, very prestigious literary prizes, or whether it's even through something like this summer, a lot of Native and Indigenous film festivals obviously had to go online because of the pandemic, rather than take place across North America. And then that, suddenly broadens out. You can have a global audience engaging with some of the most recent Indigenous filmmakers and appreciating and valuing their work in a way that would never have been possible in other years.
The only upside, I think, of the pandemic has been that so many more things are accessible this year digitally, which
Yeah.
I always feel guilty when I haven't taken enough advantage of all the things that are just a Zoom click away. But
I know there's too many, and then you think at some point I need to rein in, and like there's almost too many book festivals in a calendar year for you to just continually go and attend all the events.
100%.
It's good thesis procrastination though.
So I guess kind of talking about research and thesis procrastination, I was wondering, as you're in your fourth year of your PhD, and I'm in my first, although it's quickly coming into a close and all the deadlines are looming for me. Do you have any advice for either pacing or enjoying it, or taking the time to actually appreciate what you're doing, or also telling yourself to not take too much time to appreciate, but to speed it up and get on with it?
I'm probably not the right person to talk to about speeding up because I think like it still feels like I'm taking longer than I should, even though there is a pandemic on right now. Um, I'm sure some of the advice, especially when I think of my first year, because that'll just have been so different to what your first year has been like, with it just being all virtual. Um, but I think the first year and moving into the second year is a really good time to work out between you and your supervisors, like what's the best working relationship for you all, and what does that look like? You know, do you prefer to be supervised with a fairly small level of detail, or do you prefer to like be let loose and then just kind of be guided back to your thesis after reading all these wonderful new things? So working on how best both you and your supervisors, like, I guess, expectations and how you work together. Once you can like find that balance where everyone feels this is a really effective working relationship and everyone's meeting each other's expectations, that will like really help in later years as it becomes, a bit more pressured to write and produce the research. You don't, I suppose you don't want to find yourself like asking for particular type of feedback and then they give you a completely different style, and it can be really disheartening, but actually there's just been a miscommunication there, about what you would really value and what approach is best for you. Other pieces of advice, I would say, maybe this is already happening to you. I'd say don't be afraid about your project changing and developing. That's definitely been the case for me, even even given the fact that my master's dissertation and then what this thesis will be, that they are linked. And I was expecting the connection to be closer than it's going to be by the time the thesis is finished. So don't be afraid about going in new directions. Maybe realizing that, oh, you've reached a bit of a theoretical dead end and you need to go down another path, even though that can be frustrating, I think, and it's tempting to think of that as like wasted time. I think it's actually better to frame it as, this is the sign of like how much work you've put into it since doing your proposal and since starting the PhD. If you're working full or part-time on a project, of course your ideas are going to develop and change over the course of months and years. So I wouldn't be concerned if you see the project morphing into something you weren't expecting.
I think that's something that I definitely needed to hear a little bit, so thank you for that.
Oh, good.
And I guess that kind of also brings up the question that I wanted to ask is, how do you feel about now that this is getting towards the end of your time as a PhD candidate, and
Mhm.
that again, like, not to be, I don't want this question to be intimidating or anything like that, because given everything you've done, I'm sure it's going to be a very smooth transition.
Oh,
But how
thank
do you
you.
feel about that transition coming up? Like, what are your thoughts and emotions, or what are you hoping for the next couple years?
Well, it does feel a little bit tricky to even like find the headspace that's outside of this thesis at the moment, but I would love to continue in a broader way of working both within Indigenous studies and medical humanities. I'd love to carry on and do a postdoc, although I'm not quite sure what that would look like or how closely related it would be to the thesis. I guess we'll see when I've got reclaimed a bit of my headspace back. Um, but it right now it is tough to think about what's next, and the extent to which postdocs and job opportunities have been affected by COVID is something I try not to think about too much right now, because it's definitely there. I'm not quite sure how much things will bounce back to what the job market or the postdoctoral opportunities were before COVID. Maybe we'll bounce back in time, but it's definitely that's the route I would like to go down and publish a few more sections of my thesis once it's done and the corrections are done.
You've had the support of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and I was wondering, how has that kind of affected your time as a PhD candidate? I know they have lots of opportunities for training and meeting people and networking, and I just kind of wondered if you could speak a little bit about your experience with them.
Yeah, so the support, both like financial and through training and opportunities that's offered by the AHRC is kind of then it's delivered regionally. So I would also say I'm funded by SAGSA, by the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities, as the Scottish uh, region regional graduate school. And I mean, the first thing to say is like I simply couldn't have done this PhD without that financial security and backing, and I know I'm incredibly fortunate to have had that. Um, Also, I'm incredibly fortunate that when the pandemic hit and that initially came at the end of our third year, so the end of our funding period, that obviously brings up a lot of uncertainty, and with facilities, libraries, offices closing, that kind of slows down the rate of work. So we were very lucky that SAGSA was able to give us funded extensions um, for a period of time to cover that upheaval. And that's so the quick answer is it's the financial security that's meant I can completely like research full time and be paid to do that is an incredible blessing to have. And then, like, as well as that, I think LLC is quite a big department for a graduate school. There's plenty, and we're lucky to have so many graduates working alongside each other from disciplines. Not every university department quite looks like that. So the SAGSA cohort and being able to meet with and get to know other arts and humanities researchers is really useful. There's probably more opportunities or more types of training and skills-based development work than any one candidate can make use of. But I know people who've been able to do internships that's really enhanced their thesis, or they've been able to spend a semester at a college or university abroad, and that's been supported by SAGSA to really enhance their PhD career trajectory. It's also something I've really appreciated about SAGSA over the last few years is not just the training or the workshops that they themselves organise, but they're always interested in hearing from us ourselves as a cohort what training needs we've identified. Perhaps it's because it lies outside of our discipline or outside of our departments. As all of the universities in Scotland, they can't offer very identical, consistent programs of training across each and every department. So SAGSA is very willing to like support your own ideas of organising training and workshops that maybe they weren't aware that you weren't being trained on a particular skill set, but you've realized it's really useful and there's a need for it within the whole cohort. So it does it's a very dynamic process that really helps sort of improve our skills as researchers.
I've not had any interaction with SAGSA, but just in Scotland in
Mm.
general, I find the ability to listen to critique from the student population at the University of Edinburgh even has been really something I wasn't expecting.
Mhm.
So it's good to hear that that continues up higher than even just the university level, that the people who are producing this funding aren't just doing it to do it, but to actually listen and improve that
Yeah.
training. That is great. Okay, so I guess let me just see. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I have one question more that I usually ask. I'm trying to ask everyone because,
Okay.
again, I'm from the US, so I've lived here now since 2018,
Mhm.
but have not been able to drive during that time, and there's so much of the UK that I want to see. But I was wondering, where is your favorite place to visit in Scotland and why?
Well, it's actually not too far from Edinburgh, so you probably wouldn't need to drive. A bus or a train might be enough.
Great.
Um, so
That's what I like to hear.
when we can do all of that. My
Yeah.
dad grew up in Edinburgh, and his side of
Oh.
the family is Scottish. So although they're no longer with us, when my grandparents retired, they moved out to East Lothian and to a small village near the coast. So it's not that far away from Edinburgh. But my favourite place has to be Tinningham Beach, which is quite close to Dunbar and Belhaven Bay. But that's where summer holidays were spent, and birthdays and bonfires, and it's where sort of all of the extended family would congregate at granny and granddad's house, and lots of
Oh.
weekends spent on the beach. So that was that's probably still my favourite place. And once I'm back in Edinburgh, and once we can travel more than 5 miles or whatever it is, I'll definitely be going for some more walks out there.
I mean, that sounds lovely. I think I really need to take advantage of the Scottish beaches a bit more. I know they're not necessarily what you think of as like the ones that you lay out on a blanket, but I grew up spending my summers on the Oregon coasts in
Right.
America, which is very similar weather-wise. So it will
Mm.
make me, I think, somewhat homesick for that and
Oh,
also very excited to see more of it. I think that sounds absolutely lovely. And if I can get there, like you said, without spending a couple hours and a couple £100 on a train ticket, then
yeah,
I'm very excited. That sounds
yeah.
lovely.
There's so many more parts of Scotland I'd love to see, but not having a car in Edinburgh has been a little bit of a limiting factor in that, sort of not quite being able to just drive up into the Highlands or the Cairngorms as some of my
Yeah,
friends do. But
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, and if hopefully soon we'll be able to do that and
yes,
not get in trouble. So,
yes, share cars with other human beings again.
oh, the dream.
Yeah,
Seriously. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think that it's been
you're really
amazing.
welcome.
So, thank you. Beyond the Books is a podcast from the University of Edinburgh School of Literatures, Languages, and Cultures. Thank you so much for listening today, and keep an eye posted for new content, which is coming soon.